Hey there, welcome back to our channel. In this video, I'm going to tell you the story of Brighty, the Grand Canyon donkey. Now here's a statue of Brighty on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and it looks innocent enough, but you would be surprised at the controversy that came about when the park removed this statue in the 1970s. So I'm going to tell you the whole story behind the statue and behind Brighty the donkey. So first, a real quick difference between horses and donkeys. So horses are, of course, larger animals. They were brought here by the Spanish in the 1500s. The donkeys were actually brought here by the Spanish in the 1500s as well, but they're considered a different species than the horse, and they're smaller and they're more stubborn. The mules that you see today at the Grand Canyon, they're actually a mix between a donkey and a horse, and they're really good for riding into the canyon because they have the carefulness of a donkey, but they have the size of a horse and the compliance of a horse. This video, though, is about donkeys in the canyon, not mules, so I want you to keep that separate. The story of the donkeys in the Grand Canyon is that, again, they were brought here by the Spanish in the 1500s, and after a while, there were donkeys and horses all over the West. A lot of them were just roaming around wild. Prospectors used donkeys as they were prospecting in the mountains and in places like the Grand Canyon because they're real sure-footed animals. The Grand Canyon was kind of a hotbed for mining and prospecting until Teddy Roosevelt made it a national monument and kept all that out. When prospectors failed to find what they needed, or after Teddy protected the park, they just left the donkeys behind. So there were hundreds or maybe even thousands of donkeys just roaming around the Grand Canyon for quite a while. One of these was a donkey named Brighty. Now, Brighty was roaming around the north rim of the canyon. Literally, when visitors started arriving in the early 1900s, they found this donkey just kind of sitting there by his tent, waiting for his owners to return. We now believe that his owners actually drowned in the Colorado River, but he was just kind of wandering around by their tent. He took a liking to the visitors on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. At the time, the Grand Canyon Lodge didn't exist. There was just a bunch of tents around there. A tent company called the Wiley Tent Company ran the operations there. The son of the owner would use Brighty to get water from Roaring Springs and to take it to the tent camp. In exchange, he would feed Brighty his pancakes. And so it became real common to just see Brighty hanging around the campground waiting for pancakes. He would help out with the water, but he was kind of like an independent donkey, but a little bit domesticated. The story is that he would let kids ride him, but if they were too big or if they tried to drive him too hard, he'd kick them off. He met President Teddy Roosevelt when Teddy Roosevelt went there to hunt. There's a little bit of a debate as to whether the two actually met or not, but that's the story. Brighty was named Brighty after the Bright Angel Creek, which is one of the main creeks that run there through the Grand Canyon. Brighty died in 1922, and about the same time that he died, the National Park Service was on a mission to kill all the donkeys in the Grand Canyon. This is because they have a mission to preserve the parks as natural as possible. And what they said is the donkey is not a native animal. The donkey was using up the resources that the native animals needed, like the bighorn sheep. So they started shooting donkeys in the Grand Canyon. And over the course of 10 years, they shot about 1,400 donkeys in the Grand Canyon. Now, they didn't remove them because it was too cost prohibitive. It cost about $1,000 to remove a donkey, and that was back in the 1920s. So they just went around shooting them. Well, the killing spree kind of went on for a while until in the 1950s, a horse lover and an author named Margaret Henry happened upon an old story about Brighty that she found in a magazine from the 1920s. And she got really interested in Brighty and in the donkeys at the Grand Canyon, so she traveled to the canyon and asked everybody she knew what they remembered about Brighty the donkey. And everybody told her all these stories, and she put them together in a book. She wrote a kid's book about Brighty of the Grand Canyon. And this became quite a popular book in the 1950s, and popular enough that they made a movie about it in the 1960s called Brighty of the Grand Canyon. People really kind of got interested in Brighty and in the donkeys, and that's when it really kind of came to light that the National Park Service had been shooting these donkeys in the Grand Canyon. So there's quite a bit of an uproar in the 1970s about this killing spree that the National Park Service was going on with the donkeys. Now, the interesting thing is when the movie was made in the 1960s, they made a statue. They made this statue of Brighty to promote the film. When the film had gone through its course in the theaters, the director donated that statue to Grand Canyon National Park, and they put that statue on the south rim. So today it's on the north rim, but back then they put it on the south rim in on display in the visitor center. Well, this was right as the controversy was starting to heat up in the 70s, and people would go there and they'd say, hey, you've got this cute statue of these donkeys, but you're shooting them all. So it kind of became a problem. There was a lot of animal rights groups that were saying, hey, you shouldn't be shooting these donkeys. And the National Park Service was trying to defend itself by saying the science shows that they need to be removed because they are a pest. So the National Park Service removed the statue because they were tired of answering questions about it. It kind of made them look worse. Some of these animal rights groups formed a Bring Back Brighty campaign and said, hey, you need to bring back the statue. This just shows that you're embarrassed by what you're doing. It's really quite a whole controversy going on. Throughout the 1970s, the National Park Service took plenty of public comments, and they were really developing a new plan for how to deal with this problem. In 1980, they released their game plan for how to deal with the donkeys, which was they were still going to remove the donkeys. They said, we must remove every last donkey from the Grand Canyon in order to preserve it. By the way, there are still plenty of donkeys, as I mentioned, roaming around the West, and not all the national parks have been able to remove them. From my understanding, Death Valley National Park has quite a few donkeys. It's a real problem. They don't have a budget to get rid of the donkeys. Rangers don't like shooting them because it makes them look bad. Now, these images are actually from Custer State Park in South Dakota. Something to understand here is wild burros and wild horses are actually protected under a law in 1971 called the Wild Free Horse and Burro Act of 1971, but that act does not apply to the National Park Service. We've encountered these wild donkeys in Custer State Park in South Dakota and also in Oatman, Arizona, where they'll walk right into the businesses. They're really so friendly and they're so much fun. But in 1980, the Grand Canyon said, we're eliminating them for good. And they gave these animal rights groups some time to form a rescue operation if they wanted to. There was a group called the Fund for Animals that stepped in and raised money, about $500,000, to rescue over 500 donkeys from the Grand Canyon. And they helicopter rescued them and took them to a place in Texas and adopted them out and stuff like that. There were newspaper advertisements trying to raise funds for this, saying that they were on burrowed time. And then that winter, park officials went through and shot the remaining donkeys to completely eliminate them from Grand Canyon National Park. Then they built a fence on the side of the park where the donkeys might be able to enter. So today they are donkey free park. Again, they have mules that are used as transportation down to the bottom of the canyon, but they do not have any more wild donkeys roaming around the Grand Canyon. But again, there are still some other donkeys roaming around the West, and they're just delightfully friendly. They're so cool. We went to Custer State Park in South Dakota and saw a bunch this last year, and they're just awesome. One final note on this story. You may be wondering, I mentioned that Brighty died in 1922. You might be wondering a little bit about that. If you have kids watching, you might want to turn it off right now. The book does not talk about how Brighty died, and neither does the movie. But sadly, Brighty got caught up in a snowstorm in the 1920s with a couple of guys who were kind of on the run. There was a thief who was actually running from the law, and up at the north rim of the Grand Canyon, it gets very snowy during the winter. They actually close the park because there's too much snow. This thief got snowed in on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, and Brighty happened to be around, and so that he didn't die, he ate Brighty. He ate poor Brighty. He didn't know it was Brighty, apparently. But the next year, when visitors started arriving again and when the park officials started arriving, they noticed Brighty was dead. Today, they have returned the statue of Brighty. I believe they returned Brighty in the 80s or 90s. But they put him on the north rim, which is where he lived and where he belongs. And if you go there, they have some pictures about him with a little display and a little story about cute Brighty the donkey of the Grand Canyon. So if you're interested in Brighty, feel free to check out the kids' book. If you do visit the north rim of the Grand Canyon, make sure to go rub Brighty's nose for good luck. Okay, if you liked this video, please give it a like. If you want more stories and tips and information about the West, please consider subscribing. This is one of the many stories we're going to include on our audio guide for the Grand Canyon. So if you're visiting the Grand Canyon sometime soon, check out our website, we'rintherockies.com, for our guides. We'll put links in the description. Thank you so much for watching.